They thought she was a grieving widow with no one left to fight for her. They thought the uniform in the frame on her wall was just decoration. On a Wednesday afternoon in Atlanta, a man named Troy Maddox made the worst business decision of his 43-year life. He looked at a woman in a black dress sitting across from him in a leather chair and saw someone he could push around. What he didn't see were the 3 stars on the folded flag sitting in a cedar box in her living room, or the 11-digit case number from the Department of Defense Investigative Service that had been open for 4 months. He had 6 hours to reverse course. He chose wrong. Sergeant Major Celestine Voss-Tarrant had buried her husband on a Tuesday in November, under a sky so grey it looked like the whole world had pulled its curtains shut. Master Sergeant Elroy Voss-Tarrant had served 22 years, 2 combat tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and came home without a scratch, only to die of a cardiac event at 51 while sitting in his recliner watching a football game. The Army gave her the flag, the escort, the 21-gun salute. What the Army could not give her was the money. The house on Peachtree Mill Road was theirs together, bought in 2009 with a VA loan and 18 years of careful saving. After Elroy died, Celestine did everything right. She notified the mortgage servicer. She submitted the death certificate, the insurance documentation, the VA survivor benefit paperwork. She had been a logistics coordinator for the 3rd Infantry Division for 11 before her medical discharge. She understood process. She understood documentation. She understood the importance of keeping every single receipt. Ridgeline Home Services and Mortgage did not understand who they were dealing with. The letters started 6 weeks after the funeral, thin white envelopes with a red stamp across the corner, each one escalating in language and in threat. Past due. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. The account had been flagged as delinquent because someone in Ridgeline's processing department had applied her November payment to a ghost account number. A clerical error that cascaded silently for 3 months while she was in grief and then suddenly became her emergency to fix. Celestine called the customer service line 14 times. She was transferred to 7 different departments. She was told the issue had been resolved on 4 separate occasions. Each time, she received another letter within the week. When she finally requested an in-person meeting at the Ridgeline Regional Office in Midtown Atlanta, she was given a 2 p.m. appointment with a senior account manager named Troy Maddox. The office was the kind of place designed to make you feel smaller than you were. The ceilings were high, the furniture was leather and chrome, and the receptionist spoke in a tone that suggested you were mildly inconveniencing the building by existing inside it. Celestine wore her black dress and low heels. She carried a leather portfolio that contained every document she had ever exchanged with Ridgeline, organized by date and cross-referenced by account number. She had printed a timeline on a single sheet of legal paper in 10-point font. She was ready. Troy Maddox was not what she expected. He was perhaps 35, with a firm handshake and an expensive watch that he glanced at before she had even sat down. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the meeting will be short. "Mrs. Voss-Tarrant," he said, opening a thin file on his desk. "I've reviewed your account. I understand you've had some concerns." Concerns. The word landed like a stone dropped onto a quiet pond. "I have documentation of a systematic error in your payment processing that has resulted in a fraudulent delinquency notation on my account," Celestine said, her voice even. "I'd like to walk you through it." Maddox waved his hand, not dismissively exactly, but close. "Our records show a missed payment in November, then an irregular partial in December. Our standard protocol. Your standard protocol processed my November payment to account number ending in 7741, Celestine said, opening the portfolio. "My account ends in 7712. I have the confirmation number, the wire transfer record, and a statement from my bank confirming the funds were drawn and received by your institution. The money arrived. Your system misfiled it." Maddox looked at the sheet. She slid across the desk. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he doesn't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would cost him effort. "These processing issues can take time to investigate," he said finally. "I can open a formal inquiry, but I have to be transparent with you, Mrs. Voss-Tarrant. The foreclosure timeline doesn't pause for internal investigations. If the account isn't brought current by the 30th, we'll proceed as scheduled." Celestine held very still. In the Army, she'd learned that stillness was a form of power. It unnerved people who expected reaction. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that your company's accounting error, documented and provable, will result in the foreclosure of my home, and your position is that I need to pay again while you investigate whether you mishandled money I already gave you. I'm telling you we have a process." Maddox had stopped making eye contact. He was looking at his computer screen now, already signaling that this meeting was concluding. "You're welcome to file a formal written complaint with our resolution department. There's a form on our website." There it was. The form on the website. The digital door slammed in her face. Celestine closed her portfolio. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice once in this office, and she would not start now. "I want to make sure I understand your position clearly," she said. "You acknowledge receipt of my documentation. You're choosing not to pause the foreclosure timeline to investigate your institution's own processing error, and you're directing me to a website form." "I understand this is a difficult time," Maddox said. The sentence had the hollowness of a phrase rehearsed for exactly this kind of meeting. "I'm sorry for your loss." He said it the way people say, "I'm sorry for your loss," when they're actually sorry you're still in their office. Celestine stood. She smoothed the front of her dress and picked up her portfolio. She looked at Troy Maddox for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Thank you for your time," she said. She walked out of the building and into the Atlanta afternoon. The sun was low and orange. She sat in her car for 3 minutes. She was not crying, she was thinking. Then she made a phone call. What Troy Maddox did not know, what he had no reason to know because he had not asked a single question about her beyond her account number, was that Celestine Voss-Tarrant was not simply a widow navigating a bureaucratic nightmare on her own. Before her medical discharge, she had spent 4 years attached to the Army Inspector General's office, specifically in the division that investigated financial fraud and contractor malfeasance. She had helped build the case that resulted in a defense contractor losing a $400 million procurement deal in 2017. She understood financial documentation the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every nerve, every vein, every place where something could go wrong. She also knew that what Ridgeline was doing to her was not unique. She had been talking to her neighbors for 2 months, talking to people in the waiting room when she called that customer service line, the ones who stayed on, hold long enough to find each other. A retired school teacher who had submitted her final mortgage payment in August and was served foreclosure papers in October. A disabled veteran 2 counties over who had been told his account was current 3 times before receiving a notice of sale. A pastor in Decatur whose payment records had been altered in the system after he questioned a fee. 7 households, 7 stories with the same fingerprints. The phone call she made from the parking lot was to a woman named Special Agent Dorothea Crane with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Enforcement Division. They had worked adjacent cases during Celestine's IG days. Crane had been waiting for a trigger case, something with clean documentation and an articulate complainant who could withstand scrutiny. She had been waiting, in her words, for someone organized enough to make it bulletproof. Celestine said, "I have 14 months of payment records, wire transfer confirmations from 3 different institutions, a timeline cross-referenced against Ridge's own confirmation numbers, and 6 other affected households who are ready to provide sworn statements." There was a pause. "When can you come in?" Crane asked. What happened next took 6 weeks, which sounds slow until you understand what was being constructed. Crane's team pulled Ridgeline's payment processing logs under a civil investigative demand. What they found was not a clerical error. It was a pattern. Accounts flagged for internal audit, payments redirected to suspense accounts and held, and delinquency notices generated automatically, while the flagged amounts sat unreported. The suspense account funds were being used to cover short-term liquidity gaps in Ridgeline's mortgage-backed securities portfolio. The foreclosures that resulted from manufactured delinquencies were then processed at a premium through Ridgeline's affiliated property management division, which resold distressed properties at a significant markup. In simpler language, Ridgeline Home Services was manufacturing defaults. They were stealing homes. The investigation was sealed until the morning of March 14th. Troy Maddox arrived at his office at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday, carrying a paper cup of coffee and the particular confidence of a man who had never been accountable to anything larger than a quarterly performance review. He had, in the 2 months since his meeting with Celestine, thought about her perhaps twice. She had filed the complaint form. He had seen it routed to resolution. He had assumed it would resolve. He was getting off the elevator when he noticed that the lobby was unusually busy for 8:47 in the morning. There were people in the building who did not work there. He noticed the navy blue windbreakers first. By the time he processed what the letters on the back of those windbreakers said, there were already 4 federal agents on his floor, and his office door was being held open by a man with a badge. The CFPB enforcement team, accompanied by agents from the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Office of Inspector General and 2 investigators from the Georgia Attorney General's office, arrived at Ridgeline's regional headquarters with a warrant covering financial records, electronic communications, and property transaction data going back 4 years. The company's outside counsel attempted to delay service for approximately 11 minutes. The delay did not succeed. In the conference room on the 4th floor, where Troy Maddox had held 100 meetings in leather chairs that were supposed to make clients feel small, a senior enforcement officer named Specialist Marcus Webb laid a 46-page document on the table. It was a summary of findings from the CFPB investigation. Page 3 contained a section titled Triggering Complaint. It listed the account number ending in 77112 and the name Voss-Tarrant. Celestine M. Maddox read Bayridge with his attorney next to him. He read it a second time. The attorney said something in a low voice. Maddox did not respond. He was still looking at the name. He remembered the woman in the black dress, the leather portfolio, the way she had looked at him before she left, not with anger, not with desperation, with the quiet focus of someone who had already decided what came next. He had looked at her account number and seen a delinquency. She had looked at his institution and seen a crime scene. Ridgeline's regional director was placed on administrative leave that same morning. 3 senior account managers, including Maddox, were suspended pending investigation. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by 2 Atlanta news affiliates and a national financial watchdog publication, which had been tipped by someone whose identity they declined to reveal. The full enforcement action took another 4 months to complete. When the settlement was announced, it included $27 million in restitution to affected homeowners across Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. 41 households whose properties had been foreclosed through manufactured delinquencies received compensation. 14 households, including Celestine's, had their accounts corrected, the fraudulent delinquency notations removed, and their outstanding balances formally audited. Ridgeline Home Services was fined $8.4 million by the CFPB and required to implement a third-party monitoring program for its payment processing department. 3 executives faced personal civil liability. 1 faced criminal referral. Troy Maddox lost his job on a Tuesday. His professional license application to a competing firm was denied the following spring when the enforcement action appeared in his background check. Celestine was not in the courtroom when the settlement was signed. She was at home on Peachtree Mill Road, in the kitchen, drinking coffee at the table where she and Elroy used to eat Sunday breakfast. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet when they've been through something and come out the other side. Outside, the dogwood in the front yard had started to bloom, white flowers on bare branches, something beautiful insisting on itself in the cold. She had not done this for the settlement money, though it covered 3 months of therapy and a new furnace. She had done it because Elroy had given 22 years to a country that guaranteed certain things in exchange, one of which was that the systems holding up ordinary life were supposed to operate with integrity, and when they didn't, someone was supposed to say so. She had been that someone. Weeks after the settlement, Celestine received a handwritten letter from the retired schoolteacher, the one whose final payment had been misapplied, the first person outside her own household who had told her she wasn't imagining things. The letter said, in part, that she had been afraid to believe anything would change, that she had started to feel like the paperwork she kept filing was just paper falling into a hole, that watching the enforcement action unfold had made her believe, again, that the system could work, if someone was willing to push it until it did. Celestine kept the letter in the cedar box with the flag. Troy Maddox had glanced at his watch before she had even sat down in that chair. He had decided in the first 60 seconds that she was a problem he could redirect with a website form. He had looked at a woman who had buried her husband, documented an injustice, built a case, and organized 6 other affected households, and seen only a grieving widow with a complaint. He had 6 hours in that meeting to ask a single question about who she was. He chose not to, and that choice cost him everything. Karma doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in a navy blue windbreaker on a Thursday morning, carrying 46 pages and a name you recognize too late. If this story made you angry, good. That anger is telling you something true. And if it gave you any hope, hold on to that too. Stories like Celestine's don't end up in the news by accident. They end up there because someone refused to let the paperwork fall into a hole. If you believe that accountability should work the same way for everyone, regardless of who's sitting across that desk, hit subscribe and stay with us. We find these stories so you don't have to wonder if they exist. They do, and we're not done telling them.